Over the course of about 2 years, 6 women would be murdered in Michigan. Would police ever catch the person responsible? Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the Ypsilanti Ripper. Viewer discretion is advised. Before we get started, as usual, if you want to see shorter form true crime stories from me, you can head on over to my TikTok page, which is also making a true crimerer, and I have like well over 2,000 videos, so hop on over there, give me a follow if you like. Today's story takes us to Michigan, specifically to Ypsilanti, Ypsilanti? Why do I sound like that, Lorraine from Mad TV? She went, Ypsilanti, Ypsilanti. Dogs didn't like that. I believe it's pronounced Ypsilanti, Michigan. In this area, you have 2 different universities. We've got Eastern Michigan University, and then we have the University of Michigan. On the evening of July 9th, 1967, a few friends were having a little get-together. 19-year-old Mary Plezar was at that party, and then when it was time for her to go, she would leave her friend's place and then begin to walk towards her apartment. She lived in an apartment in Ypsilanti near her campus, and she lived there with a few roommates. But when she was expected home by her roommates later that night, they never saw her come in. Mary never made it inside the apartment building itself. After roughly a day of them not seeing or hearing from Mary, they alerted her family, which then her family alerted police. And police were a little apprehensive to investigate this as any kind of missing persons case, just given her age. You know, college students will go off on their own, just sort of randomly at times. But her family, her roommates, her friends, this was all very odd behavior for someone like Mary. Everything she owned was still at her apartment. She brought no clothing with her, none of her belongings were with her. When police finally started to look at this as a missing persons case, they did get some information from a couple of witnesses. They had seen Mary outside of her apartment building talking to a young man who was driving a blue-gray Chevrolet vehicle. And then a couple more people would come forward to say they think they saw the same thing. About a month later, on August 7th, 1967, 2 teenagers stumbled across the body, and it was the body of Mary Plezar. She was pretty badly decomposed, so police couldn't tell for sure if she had been sexually assaulted. She was without any clothing, and her clothes were just sort of tossed next to her body. Mary had been stabbed about 35 times, but police had very, very little to go on as to who may have done this to her. At the time, they weren't able to find anyone who may have been driving a blue-gray Chevrolet at the time, or even if that person was even a suspect in this. A couple of days later, something very weird happened at the funeral home where her body was. A young man comes into the building with a camera and asks if he could take a photo specifically of Mary's body. They obviously say no, and then the guy just says, okay, and then he leaves. Like, all right. The people who work there noticed that the young man was driving a blue-gray Chevrolet. Okay, red flags. Her case went cold pretty quickly. Fast forward now to July 2nd, 1968. 20-year-old Eastern Michigan University student, her name was Joan Schell. Well, she vanished that night. She went out with some friends, and then she was supposed to be walking home, but she never got to her home. She was reported missing the following morning, but 5 days later, her body would be found. She was found partially nude on a construction site, and she was found by a couple of construction workers. The coroner was able to determine that she was definitely sexually assaulted, and she had been stabbed 20 to 30 times at least. Witnesses would come forward after the fact to say that they think they saw Joan just outside her apartment complex talking to a young man in a blue-gray Chevrolet. This time, there were a few witnesses who think they recognized the man who was talking to Joan that night, and they recognized him while he was sitting in his car. A couple of different people said that this person, they think, was John Norman Collins, who was also an Eastern Michigan University student. So police, once they found out his name, would bring him in for questioning. He wasn't under arrest. They just wanted to ask him if he was with Joan that particular evening, and he was very calm, cool, collected. He was very cooperative. He answered all their questions. He said, no, I was not with Joan that night for sure. They also asked him about Mary Plessar, and he said, I didn't know who she was, and no, I was definitely not with her that night. Police had absolutely nothing to pin on him for these two murders, or even one of them. They had no physical evidence. They had only just witness statements of people who think they saw him with the victim. And you can't just go off of, well, I think it might have been him. So they let him go. Almost another year later, on March 21st, 1969, 23-year-old law student Jane Mixer would go missing. So she was reported missing that morning. She had gone out the night before and again didn't return home. So this is all sounding very similar. That same day, a young boy goes to his house with a wrapped gift. He shows his mom, "Mom, look what I found. I found this wrapped present." And she says, "Where did you find that? And why did you take it?" And he said, "Well, I found it at the cemetery." And his mom's like, "What? No, okay, let's go back and return that gift to where you found it." So he brought her to the cemetery where he found the gift. He brought her to the exact location. And there, well, the mom noticed something a little bit more than just a present. She saw like a yellow raincoat kind of just spread out on the ground, but it looked like something was underneath it. She lifted it up, and it was a body of a young female. It was confirmed to be that of Jane Mixer. She had been shot twice in the head, and she was also sexually assaulted. She also had ligature marks around her neck. This is the first time the victim was not stabbed, and this victim in particular was shot. So police were like, well, this can't be by the same person because this feels different, it looks different, different weapons were used. So we don't think it was the same person, but we'll keep it in the back of our minds. But like the first two victims, this case went cold. Not too soon after this, on March 22nd, 1969, 16-year-old Marilyn Skelton would go missing. And this is literally all in the same time frame of the previous victim. Marilyn was the first one of the victims to not be one of the college students. She was a dropout. She was kind of known as a problem in the community with the law. She dealt drugs. She did drugs. So she was sort of outside of the norm of the victims that have been killed before. On March 22nd, 1969, it is alleged that she was actually out hitchhiking, which is something that she very commonly did in the area. But a few days later, on March 26th, 1969, her body would be discovered. And she was found in pretty brutal fashion. She was found completely unclothed. It was pretty obvious that she was sexually assaulted. And the killer took a tree branch and he shoved it inside of her private area as she was posed in a sexual position. Now she was beaten to death, And again, this is a little outside of the previous victims. So killed in a slightly different fashion. This time she was posed very crudely. So they weren't really sure, is this the same person? But this is all happening in the same time frame, so it's gotta be, right? A few weeks later, on April 14th, 1969, the youngest victim would come into play. 13-year-old Dawn Bassam, she had gone out to hang out with some friends the night before, and then she never got home. Her parents would report her missing that night because she's 13 years old and she didn't come home. But her parents did not have to wait long to find her. It was the very next day, kind of early in the afternoon, on a desolate country road, sort of in a field, they found the 13-year-old's body. She too had been sexually assaulted. She was partially clothed. Her clothes were sort of just tossed to the side. She had a black rope tied around her neck, and it appeared that she had been strangled with that rope. And then something different this time. Her breasts were partially cut off. It looks like the killer tried to cut them off, but could not do it, so just left it as it were. In a nearby, abandoned farmhouse, police would find a couple articles of her, clothing, but ripped articles of clothing that belonged to her. They also found more of the same exact black rope that was used to wrap around her neck in that farmhouse. And they also found items that belonged to a few of the previous victims inside this farmhouse. Now, police did not know who owned it. There was no records, but no one was currently living in it. So it looks almost like a squatter took it over. At this point, the media was now calling this unknown murderer the co-ed slayer. Some were calling him, or her, probably him, the Ypsilanti Ripper. June 8th, 1969. A 21-year-old University of Michigan student. Her name was Alice Callum. She was at a friend's house. They were having a party. She decided it was getting late, so she decided to go home. So she would walk home, but then, broken record here, she never made it home. She would be found the next day. She was found in an open field near another abandoned farmhouse. She had 2 stab wounds directly to her heart, a gunshot through her head, and then she also had her throat cut so badly that they could actually see her spine. She too was definitely sexually assaulted, and her clothing was just again thrown around. So now this time we have another victim with a gunshot wound. So this brought police back to Jane Mixer, who was also shot. So police are now thinking that this is the work of the same person. This person is deciding to mix it up to probably throw police off, but eventually that wouldn't really work. Now, by this time, obviously, the public is horrified. They're terrified. They don't want to leave their homes, especially they don't want their teenage daughters leaving. The University of Michigan and Eastern Michigan University students are all in a panic. They don't want to leave their dorms. They don't want to leave their apartments. They don't want to go to parties. They don't want to do anything because now everyone is absolutely petrified. Reportedly, when this was all happening, the sales of guns, knives, mace, and then security bolts for doors, the sales were through the roof. I can understand why. Everyone stopped hitchhiking, and you got to remember back in the 60s and 70s and even the 80s, hitchhiking was a big thing. It was something that people commonly did. But now they're no, not getting a car with anyone. So by this time, police had interviewed 1,200 registered sex offenders, not just in the state of Michigan, but the states surrounding it. They interviewed other known criminals, and all of that came to nothing for them. Police were given thousands and thousands of tips, but pretty much none of them led to anything significant either. So at this point, they got desperate. They enlisted the help of a psychic. Reportedly, the psychic was able to lead police to every single location where the bodies were found, and reportedly, the psychic was not told ahead of time. But the newspapers had reported the crimes before, so it's extremely possible they just got the locations from that. The psychic said the killer was a white male under the age of 25, that this person was not born in the United States. They said the man uses sometimes a blue motorcycle. Now, the one very odd thing is the psychic was able to reveal information about each crime scene that had not been reported in the newspapers, that had not been made public. Only the police knew the information the psychic was telling them in terms of the crime scenes themselves. And finally, the psychic said that this killer is going to strike one more time before they are caught. Which brings us to July 23rd, 1969. 18-year-old Karen Sue Beineman would go missing. She was last seen on the afternoon of July 23rd, 1969. She was seen walking towards a wig shop in Ypsilanti. The day after, when her family hadn't heard from her, when her friends, other students hadn't heard from her, she hadn't made any of her obligations that she was supposed to go to, she was reported missing, especially given what was been going on the past couple of years. 3 days later, she was found. She was found lying face down near the Huron River Parkway. She was completely without clothing. She had bruises, and it looked like she had been beat kind of just all over her body. She also had her skull fractured by what they thought was some sort of blunt force instrument. She had also been strangled, and they believe that the strangulation was what actually killed her, but she did also have some pretty severe brain damage from the blows to the head. Her neck and her arms and her breasts were also burned. And yes, she was sexually assaulted. And then in this case, they actually found 3 strands of hair on the victim, and it was blonde hair, which did not match the victim herself. So police in their investigation did find out that she had gone into the wig shop. The owner of the store confirmed she was in there. She bought something for about $20. That same day, a young man was observed kind of around her. That man had arrived in that area on a blue motorcycle. Karen was seen actually physically having a conversation with this man and interacting with him. She told the store owner, and this is a quote, "I've got to be the bravest or dumbest girl alive because I've just accepted a ride from that guy." He was then observed by multiple people getting on the back of that motorcycle with that man, and then they drove off. And then you know what happens next. Now, like I said, several people noticed this interaction, and including the owner of the wig shop, other people as well said, "We think we know who the man is." Earlier that day, that same man had been observed at Eastern Michigan University on that same motorcycle. Many students were interviewed, and they were asked about this man, and they said that he was known as like a thief on campus. Also a cheat. He cheated on tests and cheated on, homework and whatnot. This was a student of Eastern Michigan University. They all described him as a guy with a very hot temper, and he could get very aggressive with women. There was a rumor that he had actually sexually assaulted a student like a year or so prior. One time, this man would grope a woman's breasts, and then she had made a comment about her menstruating, and he said, "Ew, that's disgusting. You're a gross woman." But he got really mad at her for saying that, even though he just basically assaulted her. This same guy was going around talking about the murders of the women. He was talking about the details of the crimes, and he said that he got the information from a family member who, I guess, knew police, and that's how they knew the information. But this student was almost like smiling and like giddy about it. They said he was describing this stuff with like creepy delight. In their interviews, police would find out that this man was also revealing details about the crime scenes that the public never knew. And they interviewed police officers, and none of them knew this young man or any of his family members. And then this man reportedly knew each of the victims in some capacity. Who was this man? His name was John Norman Collins. Remember him? John Collins was born on June 17th, 1947. And he was actually born in Canada, but eventually the family would move down to Michigan. His birth father was an alcoholic, he was abusive, and he essentially just picked up and abandoned the family when John was about a year old. Pretty soon after that, his mother remarried, and this guy was an abusive alcoholic. This guy once took a very young John Collins while they were in the car, and he threw the child across the car towards his mother. When, the mom and the stepdad were having an argument. He threw the kid. And then one time, this same stepdad was being confronted by another person with a gun. So he picked up John Collins and he put them, and he was 3 years old at the time, he put him in front of him. He used this 3-year-old boy as a shield during this. The guy never fired a shot, of course. By 1951, the mom took all the kids and left. At that point, they relocated to Detroit, Michigan. And then she married William Collins. Yep, you guessed it, an abusive drunk. They divorced by about 1956. Now, fast forward to 1965, John Collins had graduated high school. John was actually an honors student. He was tri-captain of the football team. He was the school's star pitcher for the baseball team. He was the president of something called the C Club. I'm not sure what that is, and that was like the letter C Club. He very quickly, after graduating high school, started college at Eastern Michigan University. There, he was studying to eventually become an educator. But by his sophomore year, his grades began to decline, and he had been accused by teachers and other students of cheating. By 1966, his violent side finally kind of came to the surface. His sister was pregnant with, her husband or boyfriend, but then John found out that she was having an affair with another man. So John beat the ever-living shit out of this man, and then he beat his sister. So obviously the dude had problems. Now back to the murders. Police were going around showing photos of John Collins to all of the witnesses who had seen a young man with a victim before that victim was murdered. Every single witness, there was about 7 of them, all confirmed the young man they saw was John Norman Collins. John refused to take a polygraph test. His roommate at the time said that right around when all of this was coming out, that police were looking into him, John had like a big box full of he described as trinkets or trophies. The roommate noticed that in the box was a ripped pair of jeans. There was a single purple shoe. There was a purse amongst a whole bunch of other items. But John had taken that box somewhere and threw it all away, destroyed all the stuff inside. It's not really known because it was never found. Police really had no physical evidence to connect John Collins to any of these murders. All of the evidence they had was purely circumstantial. This is also, of course, when DNA was not a thing. They couldn't take the hair samples they found and say, oh, we can cut the root off and take DNA from it. They didn't have any of that ability. In this investigation, they found out that John may be linked to a murder from Salinas, California. Her name was Roxy Ann Phillips, and she was shot and killed inside of her home. She was just 17 years old. Now, when she was murdered in her home, John Collins was on a road trip with a friend, and yes, right at the time she was killed, they were in or near Salinas, California. Pretty much on the last day of July of 1969, police would arrest John Collins for the murders, but they really only ever could charge him with one of the murders that they had enough evidence to build a case on, and that was of the 7th victim in Ypsilanti, Karen Sue Beineman. The trial for that started on June 2nd, 1970. Using primarily circumstantial evidence and relying heavily on witness statements, they were able to secure a conviction. On August 19th, 1970, he was found guilty, and he would be sentenced to life without parole. In California, in Salinas, a grand jury actually would indict John Collins for the murder of Roxy Ann Phillips. But ultimately, they would never move forward with it because extraditing him to California was becoming a very complicated process. He was already serving life without parole in Michigan, so ultimately they all kind of just decided to let it be. All of the victims, the 7 victims in Michigan, were all linked to John. They only ever had the one suspect, John Collins, for all of them. The MO kind of changed a little bit throughout the time frame, but they were very, very confident that he committed all of them. But they just didn't have strong enough evidence to really go after him trial-wise for all the other murders. So he never went on trial for the 6 other murders in Michigan. And believe it or not, John Norman Collins is still alive, and he's about 75 years old and still rotting away in a prison cell. All raspberries. Nowadays, it's not as easy to get away with, 6 or 7 murders because, we got cell phones, we got technology all over our bodies, we got like smartwatches, we got GPS, we got freaking satellites in the sky. It's not as easy to get away with something like this, anymore, thankfully. But that is it for this case. I hope you found it interesting, of course. And like I said at the beginning, if you want to see more crime stories from me, true crime stories, you want to see them in much shorter formats, like 3-minute format, head on over to my TikTok. The information will always be down below with a description as to how to get to my TikTok page. If you want to purchase merch like this shirt that says, my dogs and I are proud true crimerers, you can actually change this. You can customize it to say my cats or my kids or my friends or my pals or my lizards, whatever. You can customize it. And I think we're going to be customizing one of the wine glasses as well. Plus we have mugs, we have hoodies. You can get like normal font, you can get rainbow font to support the LGBTQ. So we got lots of merch. The merch link is in my description below. And then finally, if you have a case you want me to cover, please first go to my case list, again in my link tree below. When you're in the list, you can scroll through the names. There's about 4,200 names on there. If you're on a computer, just hit Control F and type in a name that you are interested in me covering. And if it doesn't come up, then you can email me at mikey@truecrimerer.com. Will also be in the description below. If you're on a phone and you want to search, hit the 3 little dots and then choose Find and Replace and then put the name in there. Again, just email me the name. Just quickly, like the name, the location, when it happened, and then I can add the name to my list. So, please keep in mind, I choose these cases at absolute random, to be fair. So it could be 3 days or 3 years by the time we get to your story. So just a heads up. But that is it for today's video, folks. And until the next time, we will see ya. So ta-ta for now. True crime, Roonies. I'm gay. No, that was not the time for that. Okay.